The first time I saw her eyes, I stopped breathing. Not the dramatic gasp of a movie scene, just a quiet, absolute cessation of air moving in or out of my lungs. The kind of pause that happens when your brain encounters something it cannot immediately categorize, something that breaks the rules you didn't even know you had internalized. Her eyes were green, not hazel, not the gray-green of overcast oceans or the blue-green of cheap jewelry. Pure, unmistakable, impossible green. Like light had decided to become solid. Like someone had taken the color of spring ferns and distilled it into liquid. And here's the thing I couldn't have known then. Those eyes would lead me to a secret so disturbing that 3 different governments would eventually try to bury it. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and for the past 12 years, I've been a geneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. Before you ask, no, I don't have green eyes. Mine are the deep, unremarkable brown of my Mexican grandmother, the color of coffee grounds and river mud. I mention this only because you need to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not personal vanity or some attempt to romanticize my own reflection. This is science. Or rather, this is what happens when science runs headfirst into something it cannot explain, and instead of admitting ignorance, it builds elaborate stories to hide the truth. The official story, the one you'll find in textbooks and on reputable websites, goes like this. Green eyes are caused by a moderate amount of melanin in the iris, combined with a scattering of light through the stroma. They're rare, only 2% of the global population, because they require a very specific combination of genetic variants, primarily in the OCA2 and HERC2 genes on chromosome 15. The mutation for blue eyes arose around 10,000 years ago near the Black Sea, and green eyes emerged as a sort of intermediate step between blue and brown. There's no green pigment in green eyes, just an optical illusion. Everything is explained. Everything is understood. Everything is a lie. I didn't set out to discover the lie. I was researching the genetic basis of iris pigmentation as part of a larger project on human migration patterns. We had DNA samples from over 40,000 individuals across 6 continents, and we were mapping the distribution of eye color variants to track ancient population movements. It was routine work. Boring, even. I spent 18 months analyzing sequences, running statistical models, and finding nothing that surprised me. Brown eyes dominated everywhere except Northern Europe, where blue and green showed up at predictable frequencies. The data matched the literature. The literature matched the consensus. I was preparing to publish a paper that would have been cited by perhaps a dozen specialists and then forgotten forever. Then I got the email. It came from a colleague at the University of Tehran, a woman named Dr. Farzana Mahdi, whom I'd never met, but whose work on Middle Eastern population genetics I'd read with interest. Her email was short, almost cryptic. Asterisk Elena, I found something in our Kurdish samples that doesn't fit the models. Can you look at the attached data and tell me if you've seen anything similar? Asterisk. The attached file contained eye color and genotype information for 847 individuals from the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. The expected distribution, based on everything we knew about eye color genetics, would have been approximately 95% brown, 3% hazel, 1.5% blue, and 0.5% green. That's what the models predicted. That's not what Farzana had found. Her sample showed 12% green eyes, not hazel, shading toward green, not the ambiguous gray-green that people argue about in poor lighting. True green eyes, confirmed by standardized photography and reflectometry. 12%. In a population where the genetic variants for light eyes should have been nearly absent. I spent the next week rerunning her analysis, checking for contamination, sample mix-ups, or measurement errors. There were none. The data was clean, the genotyping was accurate, and the results were impossible. According to every genetic model we had, green eyes simply could not exist at that frequency in a population from that region. The required variants for reduced melanin production simply weren't present in sufficient numbers. And yet, there they were, green eyes, impossible eyes, looking at me from photographs of Kurdish farmers and shopkeepers and school children, their gazes holding a question that science couldn't answer. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I discovered that the story of green eyes, the one we've been telling ourselves for decades, is not just incomplete, it's catastrophically wrong. Let me explain why. The standard model of eye color genetics assumes that iris pigmentation is determined by the amount and type of melanin produced by melanocytes in the iris stroma. High melanin equals brown, low melanin equals blue, moderate melanin, combined with structural scattering and the presence of lipochrome pigment, equals green. Simple, elegant, and completely unable to explain what Farzana had found. Because here's what the textbooks don't tell you. The genetic variants associated with blue and green eyes, the ones in OCA2 and HERC2 that reduce melanin production, are not present in most Middle Eastern populations. They're European variants, product of the last ice age, spread by migrations out of the northern reef Fuja after the glaciers retreated. You don't find them at significant frequency in the Zagros Mountains. You shouldn't find them at all, really, except as rare introgression from European admixture over the past few thousand years. And yet here was a population with 12% green eyes and virtually none of the European light eye variants. Something else was causing those green eyes. Something that wasn't in any database. Something that didn't fit any known genetic pathway. I flew to Tehran in April of 2019. Farzana met me at the airport, a tall woman with steel gray hair, and the kind of direct gaze that makes you feel like you're being x-rayed. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You looked at the data," she said as we drove through the chaotic traffic. "You saw what I saw." "I saw green eyes," I said. "I did not see the genetic mechanism that produces them. Because it's not there." She glanced at me sideways. "Not in the known variants. Not in any variant we've cataloged. I've sequenced the entire OCA2 and HERC2 regions in 50 of those individuals. Nothing. No mutations, no deletions, no duplications. The genes are perfectly normal. They should produce brown eyes. They don't." I remember the exact feeling that passed through me then, a cold, creeping sensation that started at the base of my skull and spread down my spine. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a recognition that I had stepped off the edge of the known map, that everything I thought I understood about eye color genetics was about to crumble. The Kurdish village where Farzana had collected her samples was called Banay, a small settlement of about 2,000 people tucked into a valley, so remote that the road to reach it required 4 hours of bone-rattling travel over dirt tracks. The houses were stone and mud brick, clustered around a central square where an ancient pistachio tree spread shade over a worn fountain. Children played in the dust. Women in colorful headscarves went about their work. Men gathered in small groups, smoking and talking in low voices. They were, in every visible way, ordinary people living ordinary lives, except for their eyes. I walked through Banay for 3 days, photographing faces, taking buccal swabs for DNA analysis, and tried to keep my professional composure, while my mind screamed that what I was seeing was impossible. Of the 347 villagers we tested, 49 had green eyes. 49, that's 14%. In a population with no known light-eye genetic variants, no European admixture, no history of migration from regions where green eyes are common. The eyes were real. I touched them, or rather, I looked into them from inches away, my face inches from theirs, and saw the unmistakable green. Not a trick of the light, not a cultural misclassification. Green, like emeralds, like sea glass, like light through leaves. But the genetics told a different story. The sequences told me that every one of those green-eyed individuals should have had brown eyes. Their OCA2 genes were fully functional. Their HERC2 regulators were set to produce normal melanin levels. There was no lipochrome deposition beyond typical background levels. By every molecular measure, their eyes should have been as brown as mine. I called my supervisor at the Max Planck Institute, a Nobel laureate named Dr. Henrik Weber, who had spent 40 years studying human pigmentation. He listened to my summary in silence, then said 4 words that I will never forget, "Don't publish anything yet." "Why not?" I asked. "Because I've seen this before." His voice was strange, tight in a way I'd never heard. 20 years ago, a population in the Caucasus, same phenomenon. Green eyes without the genetic markers. I was told to drop it. Told by whom? He was quiet for a long moment. People who don't like questions that lead to uncomfortable answers. Then he hung up. That conversation was the beginning of my real education. Not the education they give you in graduate school, with its orderly progression of hypotheses and experiments and peer-reviewed publications. A different kind of education. The kind that happens when you accidentally brush against something powerful and secret, and you realize that the world is not at all what you thought it was. Over the next 6 months, I did what any good scientist would do. I looked for other populations with unexpected green eyes. I combed through published studies, contacted colleagues in remote regions, and traveled to places where the genetic databases said green eyes shouldn't exist. And I found them, everywhere. A village in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan. 7% green eyes, no European light eye variants. A community in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. 3% green eyes, in a population that has been isolated from Europeans for at least 50,000 years. A Bedouin settlement in the Negev Desert. 5% green eyes, in people whose ancestors never left the Arabian Peninsula. A farming village in the Andes of Peru. 4% green eyes, in a population with almost no European admixture, according to their genome-wide ancestry markers. Everywhere I looked, I found green eyes where they should not exist. And everywhere I looked, the genetics told the same story. These people carried the normal brown eye alleles. Their OCA2 genes were unremarkable. Their HERC2 regulators were typical. By every known genetic measure, they should have had brown eyes. But they didn't. Something was making their eyes green. Something that wasn't in the genes we were looking at. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about human biology. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source, an ancient skeleton. In the summer of 2020, a team of archaeologists from the University of Bologna excavated a Neolithic burial site in northern Italy, dating to about 7,500 years ago. Among the remains was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, buried with unusual care, her body positioned facing east, her hands crossed over her chest, and around her neck a necklace of carved jade beads. The archaeologists sent us bone samples for DNA analysis, hoping to learn about her ancestry and health. What we found instead made me question the very nature of human history. The woman's DNA was typical for her time and place. She was descended from early farmers who had migrated from Anatolia into Europe around 8,000 years ago. Her genome carried the standard variants for brown eyes, brown hair, and moderately light skin. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable, except for one thing. When we looked closely at the bones of her orbital sockets, the part of the skull that hold the eye, we found something that shouldn't have been there. Microscopic pits. Too small to see with the naked eye, scattered across the bone's surface like the craters of a tiny moon. They weren't caused by disease. They weren't caused by trauma. They were, according to the pathologists we consulted, consistent with prolonged exposure to something that had leached through the soft tissues of her eyes and etched the bone beneath, something that had changed the color of her eyes. We tested the bone for trace elements. The results were normal: calcium, phosphorus, traces of strontium and zinc, nothing unexpected. We tested for rare earth elements. Nothing. We tested for organic residues, hoping to find evidence of plant-based dyes or cosmetics that might have been applied externally. Nothing. Whatever had etched her orbital bones had left no chemical trace, only the physical scars of its presence. I spent weeks staring at the data from that Neolithic woman, turning it over in my mind, trying to find a connection to the living green-eyed populations I'd studied. And then, in a moment of desperate inspiration, I did something that no responsible scientist would do. I took a small sample of bone paste on the woman's orbit and had it sequenced for DNA. Not human DNA, but the DNA of everything else. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, anything that might have colonized the bone after death. The results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my office, drinking cold coffee, when an email arrived from the sequencing facility. I opened the attachment and read the list of microbial DNA fragments that had been recovered from the bone. Most of it was environmental contamination. Soil bacteria, fungal spores, the usual background noise of decomposition. But one sequence stood out. It was short, only about 300 base pairs, and it didn't match anything in the public databases. Not bacteria, not virus, not fungus, not any known life form on Earth. I ran the sequence through every alignment algorithm I could find. Nothing. I sent it to colleagues who specialize in metagenomics and viral discovery. Nothing. I submitted it to the NCBI GenBank, hoping someone else might recognize it. The submission was flagged, reviewed, and rejected within 24 hours, which is essentially unheard of for a routine sequence submission. The rejection letter came from an email address I didn't recognize, with a domain name that didn't exist. When I tried to reply, the message bounced. That was the first time I realized I was being watched. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things happened. My laboratory notebooks went missing from my locked office. The hard drive containing my raw sequencing data was corrupted, permanently, despite having passed every diagnostic test a week before. A man in an expensive suit appeared in my department, asking to speak with me about potential collaboration opportunities. He didn't show identification, didn't leave a business card, and when I asked who he worked for, he smiled and said, "We're interested in your work on iris pigmentation." When I told Henrik about the incidents, his face went pale. "You need to stop," he said. "Right now. Delete everything. Destroy your samples. Tell no one else what you found. You know what's happening." I said, "You've known for 20 years. Tell me what's going on." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes, ordinary brown eyes, filled with something I can only describe as grief. Then he unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder so old that the paper had yellowed at the edges. Inside were photographs, documents, and a handwritten letter on letterhead that I recognized immediately. The Human Genome Project, circa 1998. I was part of a team that sequenced the first complete human genome. Henrik said quietly, "What the public knows is that we published a draft in 2001. What the public doesn't know is that we finished the first complete sequence in 1998, 3 years earlier. And when we looked at that sequence, we found something we couldn't explain." He pulled out one of the photographs, a close-up of a young woman's face. Her eyes are brilliant, startling green. "This is my daughter," he said. "She was born with green eyes. Her mother has brown eyes. I have brown eyes. Both of our families, for generations, have brown eyes. Her green eyes shouldn't exist, but they do. And when we sequenced her genome, looking for the cause, we found something that had no business being in human DNA." He handed me the folder. Inside was a printout of a genetic sequence, about 15,000 base pairs long, inserted between 2 genes on chromosome 11. The sequence didn't match anything in the human reference genome, because it wasn't human at all. It was bacterial in origin, but not from any known bacterium. It was structured like a virus, but it didn't resemble any known viral family. And it contained genes that coded for proteins that had no homologs in any organism on Earth. "We called it the emerald insertion," Henrik said. "It appears in about 2% of the human population, almost always in association with green eyes. But it's not just an eye-colored gene. It does something else. Something we've never been able to fully understand." "What does it do?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said 5 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about human biology. "It rewrites the brain chemistry." The emerald insertion, Henrik explained, didn't just affect melanin production in the iris. It also encoded a small protein that crossed the blood-brain barrier and bound to receptors in the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion, memory, and perception. People who carried the insertion, the ones with true green eyes, had different brain chemistry than the rest of the population. They processed sensory information differently. They experienced emotions differently. They saw the world differently. That's why green eyes have been associated with magic and mystery throughout history, Henrik said. It's not superstition. People with the emerald insertion actually perceive reality in ways that others don't. They're more sensitive to subtle patterns. They're more attuned to the emotional states of people around them. Some of them, a very few, can see things that aren't visible to normal human vision. What kind of things? Henrik pulled another photograph from the folder. It showed a man in his 40s, with gray hair and the most intense green eyes I'd ever seen. "This is Dr. Thomas Ashworth," Henrik said. He was a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. In 1995, he reported that he could see ultraviolet light, not as a color, but as a kind of shimmer or distortion in the air. He could also see the Earth's magnetic field. He described it as a faint golden grid overlaying the landscape. His colleagues thought he was having a psychotic episode, but when they tested his vision, they found that he could actually detect patterns of polarized light that no other human can see. He had the emerald insertion. He also had an IQ of 198 and a security clearance that allowed him to work on nuclear weapons design. I stared at the photograph. What happened to him? He disappeared in 1997. Officially, he resigned from the lab and moved to a remote location in New Zealand for health reasons. Unofficially, there are rumors that he was recruited by a different kind of organization, one that's very interested in people who can see what others can't. You're talking about intelligence agencies. Henrik nodded. The emerald insertion is rare. Only 2% of the population. But that 2% possesses cognitive abilities that the other 98% lack. Enhanced pattern recognition, heightened emotional intelligence, and in some cases, genuine extrasensory perception. The kind of people who can look at a satellite image and spot the one detail that doesn't belong. Who can read a room and predict what someone will do before they do it. Who can solve problems that stump supercomputers. He closed the folder. The United States government has known about the emerald insertion since the late 1990s. So has China, Russia, Israel, and probably a dozen other countries. They've been quietly recruiting green-eyed individuals for decades, not because of their eye color per se, but because of what that eye color signifies. It's a visible marker for a suite of cognitive abilities that are incredibly valuable in intelligence work. But why keep it secret? I asked, if the emerald insertion gives people enhanced abilities, why not study it openly? Why not try to replicate it? Henrik laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Because the insertion isn't natural, Elena, it didn't evolve through normal mutation and selection. It was inserted into the human genome deliberately by something that had a very specific purpose, and we have no idea what that purpose is. The next year of my life was a waking nightmare. I continued my research, but now I was working in secret, hiding my samples and data from everyone except Farzana and a small network of trusted colleagues. We expanded our search, collecting DNA from green-eyed individuals around the world, and we found the emerald insertion in almost every case. Not all. Some people with green eyes didn't carry it, and their green eyes were the ordinary kind, explained by the standard genetic mechanisms. But the true green eyes, the ones that stopped you mid-sentence, the ones that seemed almost supernatural, those were the insertion. And the insertion was doing more than changing eye color and brain chemistry. It was also changing something else. The microbiome. Every human body hosts trillions of bacteria, mostly in the gut, but also on the skin, in the mouth, and in the eyes. The ocular microbiome, the community of bacteria living on the surface of the eye, is normally dominated by a few common species that help protect against infection and maintain eye health. But in individuals with the emerald insertion, the ocular microbiome was completely different. It was dominated by a bacterium that didn't match any known species, the same bacterium whose DNA fragment I'd found in the Neolithic woman's orbital bones. This bacterium, which we tentatively named Candidatus Chlorospectrum oculus, appeared to be in symbiotic relationship with its human host. It produced a pigment, a fluorescent green pigment that, when illuminated by certain wavelengths of light, emitted a glow that could be detected by other individuals carrying the same bacterium. In other words, people with the emerald insertion could see each other in the dark. They could identify each other across a crowded room. They could communicate, not through language, but through patterns of light emission that their specialized visual systems could detect. Fireflies, Farzana said when I told her. They're like fireflies. Bioluminescent communication. More like quantum entanglement, I said. The pigment doesn't just emit light. It emits entangled photons. Two people with a bacterium can share information instantaneously, regardless of distance. It's not telepathy. It's physics, but it looks like telepathy. We published our findings, finally, in a small journal that no one reads. The paper was carefully written to avoid mentioning the insertion's more disturbing implications. We focus on the genetic mechanism for eye color, not the cognitive enhancements or the bacterial symbiosis. It passed peer review without comment. It was cited twice in 3 years. It changed nothing. But I knew the truth. And the truth was this. Green eyes were not a random genetic quirk. They were a signal, a marker, a visible identifier for a subset of the human population that had been modified thousands of years ago by an intelligence that wasn't human. The emerald insertion was too complex, too precisely engineered to have arisen through random mutation and natural selection. It was designed, and whoever designed it had a purpose. What purpose? I spent years trying to answer that question. I traveled to remote villages, interviewed hundreds of green-eyed individuals, and collected thousands of DNA samples. I mapped the global distribution of the emerald insertion, and I found that it was not randomly distributed. It clustered along ancient trade routes, the Silk Road, the trans-Saharan caravan routes, the maritime networks of the Indian Ocean. It appeared in populations that had historically been at the crossroads of civilizations, the places where different peoples met and exchanged ideas. The insertion, I came to believe, was a kind of immune system for human civilization. It emerged in populations that were most likely to encounter new ideas, new technologies, new threats. The cognitive enhancements it provided, the pattern recognition, the emotional intelligence, the ability to see connections that others missed, made these populations better at adapting to change. They became the innovators, the problem solvers, the ones who found ways through crises that would have destroyed less flexible societies. But there was a darker possibility. The insertion also made its carriers more sensitive to certain kinds of environmental stimuli, including, possibly, stimuli that originated outside the Earth. Some of the green-eyed individuals I interviewed reported strange experiences, vivid dreams of geometric patterns, inexplicable knowledge of events before they happened, a persistent sense of being watched or guided by something beyond normal perception. Most dismissed these experiences as imagination or coincidence, but too many reported similar phenomena for me to ignore. What if the insertion is a receiver? Farzana asked me one night, as we sat in her Tehran apartment, surrounded by printouts of genetic sequences. What if it's designed to pick up signals from somewhere else? From whoever, or whatever put it there? I had no answer. I still have no answer. Tonight, as I write this, I am sitting in a small cabin in the mountains of northern New Mexico, far from any city, far from any laboratory. I am here because 3 weeks ago, a man came to my apartment in Leipzig. He was tall, thin, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes so pale they were almost colorless. He told me that my research had attracted attention. He told me that I needed to stop asking questions about the emerald insertion. He told me that if I continued, I would disappear, the same way Thomas Ashworth had disappeared. I fled that night. I left my apartment with nothing but a backpack and a flash drive containing my most important data. I flew to Mexico City, then to El Paso, then took a bus to this cabin, which belongs to a cousin I haven't seen in 15 years. I have no internet access. I have no phone. I have no way of knowing if Farzana is safe, or Henrik, or any of the other colleagues who helped me. But I have the data. I have the sequences. I have the photographs of green eyes from 100 different populations, all carrying the same impossible insertion, all seeing the world in ways that the rest of us cannot. And I have the question that has haunted me for 4 years. Who put the emerald insertion in our genome? Why did they do it? And what do they want from us? I don't have answers. But I have one more piece of evidence, something I discovered in the last week before I fled Leipzig. In the process of analyzing the bacterial DNA from a Neolithic woman's orbit, I found something I had missed before. The bacterium, Candidatus Chlorospectrum oculus, also carries the emerald insertion. Not a similar sequence, the exact same sequence. A 15,000 base pair stretch of DNA that is identical in the bacterium and in the human genome. That means the insertion didn't originate in humans. It originated in the bacterium, and it transferred from the bacterium to us. Not through normal horizontal gene transfer, which usually moves only short segments, but through something far more sophisticated, something that looks like engineering. The bacterium is not from Earth. Its genome contains sequences that don't match anything in the terrestrial database. It uses a slightly different genetic code than the standard universal code used by all known life on this planet. It has genes for proteins that have no business existing in any organism that evolved here. The bacterium is extraterrestrial, and it has been living on the surface of human eyes for at least 7,500 years, probably much longer. It has been modifying our brains, enhancing our perception, and turning our irises green in the process. And the only reason we know any of this is that I happen to look at a skeleton from a Neolithic grave and notice something that everyone else had missed. Tonight, as I sit in this cabin, watching the stars appear over the mountains, I wonder how many green-eyed people are out there right now, looking at the same stars, seeing things I cannot see. I wonder if they know what they are. I wonder if they can hear the signals that the bacterium is sending, the whispers from somewhere far beyond the solar system, the messages that have been arriving for millennia, waiting for the right receivers. I wonder if the green-eyed people are not modified humans, but something else entirely, something that's been living among us, hidden in plain sight, marked only by the color of their eyes, something that is not entirely human. Tomorrow, I will leave this cabin. I will find a way to continue my research, even if I have to do it from shadows. I will find Farzana and Henrik and the others, and we will try to understand what we have discovered. But tonight, I am writing this down because someone needs to know. Because the truth about green eyes is not just a genetic curiosity or a historical footnote. It is the most important secret in human history, and it is staring at you from every pair of green eyes you've ever seen. If you have green eyes, you have the insertion, you have the bacterium, you have abilities that the rest of us cannot imagine, and you have a choice. You can live your life as if nothing is different, or you can ask a question that I've been asking for 4 years. What are you seeing that I cannot see? And who, or what, is trying to communicate with you through the light that lives in your eyes? The answer is out there in the stars, in the ancient DNA, in the green gaze that meets yours across a crowded room, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to find it, unless someone stops me first.